Deep in the humid silence of the Yucatan Peninsula, the jungle does not simply surround stone ruins, it consumes them. Thick roots push through carved walls, strangling once precise masonry. Trees grow from the tops of temples as if the structures were never built by human hands but merely emerged from the earth itself. In places like Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan, the forest is not a backdrop to history, it is an active force reclaiming it. From above, the canopy appears continuous, an endless green ocean hiding an entire lost world beneath its surface. Before going deeper into this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. When European explorers first pushed into these regions centuries after the cities had been abandoned, they struggled to believe what they were seeing, not because the structures were small or primitive, but because they were the opposite. Massive pyramids rose above the trees, carved with intricate symbols, stairways, and ceremonial platforms. Entire complexes of plazas and palaces lay hidden in terrain that had been assumed to be sparsely populated wilderness. The assumption that such dense jungle could not support large civilizations shaped early misunderstandings of what the Maya once were. What survives in the archaeological record suggests something far more complex than isolated jungle settlements. The Maya world was a vast network of city-states, some of which supported tens of thousands of people within and around their urban cores. These were not static villages absorbed by nature over time, but thriving political and cultural centres that once pulsed with ritual life, trade, and warfare. Yet at some point, many of these cities were abandoned, not all at once, and not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a pattern that still challenges clear explanation. Scholars still debate why these cities were left behind. The evidence remains incomplete, fragmented across soil layers, broken monuments, and partially eroded inscriptions. What is certain is that by the time Spanish chroniclers arrived in the region in the 16th century, many of the greatest centres of the southern lowlands had already fallen silent. No living memory remained among the surviving populations to fully explain what had happened. The jungle had done its work thoroughly. The mystery deepens when one considers the scale of what was lost. At its height during the so-called Classic period, roughly between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya civilization supported a population that may have reached into the millions. Cities were not isolated achievements but part of a densely interconnected landscape. Raised causeways linked centres across wetlands and forests. Trade routes moved obsidian, jade, cacao, salt, and textiles across vast distances. The level of coordination required for such systems suggests political and cultural sophistication that rivals many Old World civilizations of the same era. Yet the ruins that remain give an impression of sudden absence. In some cities, construction simply stops. Temples remain unfinished. Palaces show no signs of gradual decay through continued occupation, but rather abandonment while still structurally sound. Domestic areas show kitchens with tools left in place, plazas with monuments that were never fully completed or maintained. This pattern suggests not a slow fading, but a break in continuity, something that interrupted the rhythm of daily life. One of the most striking features of these abandoned centres is how quickly nature reasserted itself. In tropical environments, vegetation grows aggressively. Within a few decades, structures that are not maintained can begin to disappear under root systems and collapsing soil. Within a few centuries, entire cities can vanish from surface view. This natural process complicates interpretation. What looks like an ancient collapse may sometimes reflect only the speed of ecological recovery rather than immediate destruction. Yet in the Maya case, there are additional signs that something more complex occurred. Some monuments were deliberately defaced or toppled. Carved steely stone slabs recording royal lineages and historical events are found broken or buried. Inscriptions that once documented dynastic achievements are sometimes intentionally erased. These acts suggest periods of political upheaval or regime change layered on top of environmental and social stress. No single explanation fully accounts for this combination of abandonment, destruction, and transformation. Archaeologists reconstruct this world not through written narratives, but through fragments. Pottery shards reveal trade connections. Soil analysis shows changes in agriculture. LIDAR scanning, a modern technology that maps hidden structures beneath forest canopies, has uncovered entire urban landscapes that were previously invisible. These scans reveal causeways, reservoirs, defensive walls, and residential zones extending far beyond what surface exploration alone suggested. The Maya world was not just large, it was densely engineered into the landscape itself. One of the lesser-known details revealed by recent research is the sophistication of water management systems. In regions without permanent rivers, Maya cities depended on reservoirs, canals, and carefully designed catchment systems to survive seasonal droughts. Some of these reservoirs were lined with plaster and engineered to reduce contamination, indicating long-term planning and environmental adaptation. This level of infrastructure suggests a society deeply aware of ecological limits, yet still vulnerable to shifts in climate or population pressure. The story that begins in these jungle ruins is not one of simple disappearance. It is a layered history of growth, adaptation, strain, and fragmentation. The silence of the abandoned cities is not empty. It is dense with unanswered questions embedded in stone and soil. Each structure that emerges from the jungle is a fragment of a larger system that once connected politics, environment, and belief into a single living network. And as the narrative moves backward from these silent ruins, away from the overgrown temples and fractured monuments, The deeper origins of this world begin to emerge long before the classic cities rose, and long before the jungle reclaimed them. Long before the jungle cities rose into stepped pyramids and carved stone monuments, the landscape of Mesoamerica is already being shaped by quiet, almost invisible revolutions. Forest edges thin in places where early communities begin to cultivate the land, while grasses are selected, tended, and gradually transformed. Over generations, human survival shifts from wandering patterns of foraging to a deeper entanglement with soil, seasons, and domesticated crops. What later becomes the Maya world does not emerge suddenly. It accumulates slowly, almost imperceptibly, across thousands of years of environmental and cultural adaptation. Archaeological evidence suggests that maize, the crop that would eventually underpin nearly every major civilization in the region, is first domesticated from wild teosinte grasses in parts of southern Mexico. The transformation is not immediate. Early maize bears little resemblance to the large, structured cobs known today. It is small, difficult to harvest, and dependent on careful selection over many generations. Yet it becomes central to survival, alongside beans, squash, chili, and later cacao. It forms the foundation of agricultural life that allows populations to stabilize and grow. In these early centuries, settlements are small and dispersed. Simple houses made from perishable materials leave faint traces in the archaeological record. What survives is often indirect soil chemistry, grinding stones, and scattered pottery fragments. Yet even in this fragmentary evidence, a pattern emerges. People are no longer simply passing through the landscape. They are staying, investing labour in the soil, and beginning to reshape entire ecosystems around sustained habitation. One of the most influential early cultures in this long development is the Olmec civilization, which flourishes along the Gulf Coast roughly between 1500 and 400 BCE, often referred to as a mother culture in older interpretations. This label is now debated by scholars who emphasize that many Mesoamerican societies develop in parallel rather than from a single origin point. Still, the Olmec leave behind striking evidence of early state formation, colossal stone heads carved from basalt, from ritual centers such as San Lorenzo and La Venta, and complex iconography that later cultures will adapt and reinterpret. The purpose of the Olmec colossal heads remains uncertain. Some theories suggest they represent rulers or elite individuals, possibly connected to lineage and authority. Others propose symbolic or religious meanings tied to power and identity. The sheer effort required to transport multi-ton stones across river systems and dense terrain suggests organised labour and political authority capable of mobilising large groups of people. Yet no written records survive from this period to clarify intent. What survives in the archaeological record suggests power expressed through stone, scale, and repetition. As centuries pass, settlement patterns become more complex. Small villages begin to cluster around ceremonial centres. These centres are not simply administrative hubs, but also places of ritual gathering, astronomical observation, and social integration. Early architectural forms raised platforms, plazas, and modest pyramidal structures begin to appear. These are not yet the monumental temples of the classic Maya period, but they reveal the beginnings of a shared architectural language that will later define the region. At the same time, early belief systems take shape around cyclical understandings of time, agriculture, and cosmic order. The cycles of planting and harvest are not just practical concerns, but are woven into ritual life. Deities associated with rain, maize, fertility, and the underworld begin to appear in iconographic traditions. These symbolic systems are not static. They evolve across regions and centuries, absorbing local variations while maintaining shared core themes. Scholars still debate how unified these early cosmologies were, or whether they represent overlapping but distinct belief systems. One of the lesser-known but significant developments during this period is the gradual emergence of early writing systems. While fully developed Maya hieroglyphic writing will not appear until later, precursors can be seen in Epi-Olmec and Isthmian scripts. These systems remain only partially deciphered, but they suggest an increasing need to record names, events, and possibly astronomical or ritual information. Writing, in this sense, emerges not as a sudden invention, but as a slow accumulation of symbolic representation tied to power and memory. Alongside intellectual and cultural growth, environmental adaptation becomes increasingly sophisticated. Early communities learn to manage seasonal rainfall through terracing, drainage systems, and controlled burning. These techniques allow agriculture to expand into more challenging terrain, supporting larger and more stable populations. However, this expansion also begins to reshape the landscape in ways that may later contribute to ecological stress. Deforestation, soil depletion, and water management challenges are already beginning to appear in localized forms, even if they are not yet widespread. By the time the foundations of what will become Maya civilization are forming, the region is no longer a sparsely inhabited wilderness. It is a mosaic of interconnected societies, each experimenting with different forms of political organization, ritual practice, and environmental management. Some regions emphasize centralized authority, while others remain more decentralized and networked. These differences will later influence how cities rise, compete, and eventually decline. A striking detail often overlooked is how deeply embedded these early societies are in their environment. Unlike later civilizations that attempt to dominate landscapes through rigid control, early Mesoamerican cultures tend to integrate themselves into ecological rhythms. Settlements align with water sources, seasonal cycles, and agricultural zones rather than imposing entirely artificial order. This relationship is not purely harmonious, but it reflects a long period of adaptation that makes later expansion possible. Still, the system being built is not stable in any simple sense. Population growth, resource demands, and emerging political hierarchies introduce new pressures. The same agricultural success that allows communities to flourish also creates dependencies on rainfall patterns, soil fertility, and coordinated labour. Small shifts in any of these factors can ripple through entire regions. It is within this slowly constructed world that the earliest direct ancestors of the classic Maya begin to emerge. City foundations are still centuries away, but the essential components are already in place: agriculture rooted in maize, symbolic systems tied to cosmology, emerging political structures, and a landscape increasingly shaped by human activity. What follows is not a sudden leap, but a gradual intensification of everything already in motion. And as these early societies continue to evolve, they begin forming connections that extend beyond local villages and ceremonial centres, setting the stage for something far more complex, a network of city-states that will eventually define the classical world of the Maya. The landscape is no longer just a mosaic of villages and ceremonial centres. It is beginning to tighten, to organise itself into something denser, more structured, and more competitive. Across the lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula, small polities are hardening into early city-states. They do not rise as a unified empire. They emerge as rivals, each carving out influence through ritual authority, agricultural control, and increasingly, strategic alliances. The jungle remains vast and dominant, but within it, human presence is becoming more deliberate, more architectural, and more politically charged. At the heart of this transformation is a simple but powerful shift surplus. Once agriculture stabilizes enough to produce more food than immediate survival requires, societies gain time to specialize, time to organize labor beyond subsistence, time to construct monuments that serve not only practical needs but symbolic and political ones. This surplus is unevenly distributed, and that imbalance becomes the seed of hierarchy. Some settlements grow into centers of power, while others become dependent satellites. The earliest city-states are not cities in the modern sense. They are layered complexes of plazas, pyramidal platforms, elite residences, and surrounding agricultural zones. Yet their influence extends far beyond their physical boundaries. Control is not maintained solely through force, but through ideology, trade, and ritual authority. Rulers present themselves not simply as political leaders, but as intermediaries between human communities and the cosmic order. This fusion of governance and cosmology becomes a defining feature of the developing Maya world. Trade routes begin to bind these emerging centers together. Obsidian from volcanic highlands travels across vast distances, prized for its sharpness and symbolic value. Jade, rare and deeply associated with life, fertility, and elite status, becomes one of the most important materials in ritual exchange. Cacao, used both as a beverage and as currency in some contexts, circulates among elites and reinforces social hierarchies: salt, textiles, ceramics. And feathers also move through increasingly complex networks. These exchanges are not random. They are structured relationships that reinforce alliances and rivalries simultaneously. One of the lesser-known but crucial aspects of this period is the role of water control in political power. Cities that manage to construct and maintain reliable reservoirs gain a significant advantage in regions where seasonal droughts can be severe. Water becomes not just a resource but a symbol of authority. The ability to store and distribute it reinforces the legitimacy of rulers, especially during dry cycles when agricultural output becomes uncertain. Archaeological evidence shows that some early centres invest heavily in water infrastructure long before large-scale monumental expansion occurs. As these systems grow, so does competition. City-states begin to define themselves in contrast to one another. Boundaries are not always fixed lines on the ground, but shifting zones of influence, marked by tribute relationships, marriage alliances, and occasional military conflict. Even early inscriptions suggest that identity is tied to place and dynasty. Rulers emphasize lineage, ancestry, and divine legitimacy, embedding political authority within long narrative traditions that are carved into stone. The environment plays a silent but persistent role in shaping this network. The lowland forests are dense, but not impenetrable. Rivers, ridges, and seasonal wetlands create natural corridors of movement. Rather than isolating communities, the landscape encourages certain routes of connection while discouraging others. Over time, these pathways become formalized into causeways and trade routes. What begins as seasonal movement gradually becomes structured communication between centers. Archaeological discoveries using modern LIDAR technology have revealed the true scale of this interconnected world. Beneath the forest canopy lie entire networks of settlements that were previously invisible. Causeways stretch for kilometers, linking major centers with secondary sites. Defensive structures suggest that some regions are already aware of external threats, or at least of the need to control movement and access. The Maya world is not scattered, it is densely organized, even when it appears fragmented on the surface. Yet this increasing complexity also introduces fragility. As more cities rise, competition intensifies. Resources that once supported small communities are now divided among larger populations. Political alliances shift rapidly, sometimes dissolving within a single generation. The same networks that enable trade also facilitate conflict, as control over routes and resources becomes a central concern of elite power. A particularly striking detail from this period is the emergence of shared cultural symbols across distant city-states. Despite political fragmentation, certain artistic styles, architectural forms, and religious motifs spread widely, this suggests not a unified empire, but a cultural system that transcends political boundaries. It is a world held together by shared ideas rather than centralized authority. Scholars still debate how cohesive this cultural sphere truly was, and whether it functioned more as a network of influence than a unified civilization. In some regions, early signs of fortification appear. Walls, defensive ditches, and strategically positioned settlements indicate that conflict is becoming more organized. Warfare in this context is not constant total destruction, but a recurring feature of political life. Raids, capture of elites, and symbolic destruction of monuments are part of a system in which power is constantly negotiated. These tensions remain localized for now, but they are beginning to shape the trajectory of larger regions. At the same time, population growth continues. Agricultural expansion pushes communities into marginal lands, increasing pressure on soil and water systems. Forest clearance accelerates in some areas, altering local climates and hydrology. While these changes are not yet catastrophic, they represent early signs of environmental stress that will later become more significant. The balance between growth and sustainability is becoming increasingly delicate. By the end of this phase, the Maya world is no longer a collection of emerging societies. It is a fully developed network of competing city-states, each embedded in a shared cultural and economic system. Yet fiercely independent in political terms, power is distributed, unstable, and constantly shifting. The foundations of what will become the classic Maya civilization are now firmly in place, but so too are the tensions that will eventually test its limits. And as these city-states grow stronger, more ambitious, and more interconnected, they move toward a period of extraordinary achievement and equally extraordinary rivalry, a phase in which architecture, astronomy, and political power reach their most dramatic expression yet. Night settles over the lowlands, and for a brief moment the jungle is quiet in a way that feels almost unnatural. Then, in the darkness, the silhouette of pyramids begins to emerge above the canopy. Stone structures rise like artificial mountains, not isolated monuments but carefully aligned components of a vast urban landscape. At their peak during the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, these cities are not hidden in the jungle. They are carved into it, structured around it, dependent on it, and constantly reshaping it. The classical Maya world is often described as a golden age, but the phrase can be misleading if taken as stability. It is more accurate to think of it as a peak of complexity, where political power, artistic expression, scientific observation, and warfare all intensify at once. Cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Palank, Copan, and Karakol are not only centres of population but nodes in a dense network of rivalry and exchange. Each city is a kingdom, and each kingdom is aware that its survival depends on both cooperation and dominance. Before going deeper into this unfolding world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At Tikal, monumental pyramids rise above the forest canopy in steep tiers of limestone, some reaching heights that dominate the surrounding landscape for kilometres. These are not just religious structures, they are political statements, visual declarations of authority designed to be seen from afar. The rulers of these cities understand that architecture is language. Stone becomes a form of communication, broadcasting legitimacy across space and time. But the classical Maya world is not defined by architecture alone. It is defined by its extraordinary intellectual systems. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient Americas. The hieroglyphs are not simple symbols, but a complex combination of logograms and syllabic signs capable of recording historical events, royal genealogies, tribute systems, and astronomical observations. Some inscriptions describe wars between cities in precise detail, including dates and named rulers, revealing a political landscape that is far more documented than once assumed. Alongside writing, the Maya construct an intricate system of timekeeping. The long count calendar allows them to track vast spans of time extending thousands of years into the past and future. This is not abstract mathematics alone. It is deeply tied to ritual life and political authority. Rulers align their reigns with specific calendrical cycles, and major events are often timed according to astronomical and ritual significance. Time itself becomes structured, measurable, and politically meaningful. One of the lesser-known but remarkable aspects of this period is the precision of Maya astronomical observation. Without telescopes or modern instruments, they track the movements of Venus, the Sun, the Moon, and other celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. Venus, in particular, holds deep symbolic significance, associated with war and transformation. Its cycles are recorded in codices and carved inscriptions, used to time military campaigns and rituals. Scholars still debate how these observations were refined to such a degree, though it is clear they relied on centuries of accumulated data. Yet this intellectual sophistication exists alongside intense political fragmentation. There is no single Maya empire. Instead, the lowlands are divided among competing dynasties, each claiming divine legitimacy. Kings are not merely rulers, but are seen as embodiments of cosmic order. Their authority is reinforced through ritual performance, bloodletting ceremonies, and public displays of connection to ancestral and supernatural forces. The line between governance and religion is not blurred, it is structurally inseparable. Among the most powerful of these city-states are Tikal and Calakmul, whose rivalry shapes much of the Classic period. These two superpowers engage in long-term geopolitical struggle, forming alliances with smaller cities, installing puppet rulers, and conducting military campaigns that span generations. Conflict is not constant warfare, but a shifting pattern of dominance and resistance. Control over trade routes, tribute networks, and strategic locations determines influence as much as battlefield victories. Inscriptions from this period reveal a world where warfare is highly ritualized but also deeply consequential. Captured elites are often displayed publicly, sometimes sacrificed, and their capture is recorded as a political achievement. These acts are not random violence but part of a structured system of power communication. Victory is measured not only in territory gained but in symbolic dominance over rival dynasties. The urban life of classical Maya cities is densely organized. Residential areas surround ceremonial cores, and causeways connect different districts. Markets likely operate in designated plazas, though their exact structure remains partially reconstructed through archaeological inference. Artisans produce ceramics, textiles, and carved objects that reflect both local identity and shared regional styles. Daily life is shaped by both elite authority and local community organization. A striking feature of this period is the contrast between monumental centers and rural hinterlands. While cities display extraordinary architectural and artistic achievement, much of the population lives in dispersed agricultural communities. These farmers support the urban elite through tribute and labor, forming the economic backbone of the system. This relationship is not static, it shifts over time, especially as population density increases and environmental pressure grows. Water management remains a critical factor in urban survival. Some cities build extensive reservoir systems capable of sustaining large populations through dry seasons. These reservoirs are often integrated into ceremonial landscapes, blending practical engineering with symbolic design. In some cases, water itself is treated as sacred, reinforcing the authority of rulers who control its distribution. Yet even these systems have limits, and their effectiveness depends heavily on consistent rainfall patterns. Environmental adaptation continues to shape expansion. Forests are cleared for agriculture, soils are modified, and wetlands are managed for cultivation. While these practices allow civilization to grow, they also introduce long-term ecological stress. Pollen analysis from sediment cores shows shifts in vegetation patterns consistent with deforestation and intensified land use. What appears as a flourishing civilization is also gradually transforming its environment in ways that may not be sustainable indefinitely. Despite these pressures, the classical Maya world reaches extraordinary heights of cultural expression. Sculpture, pottery, and mural painting become highly refined art forms. Royal courts sponsor artistic production that records historical narratives, religious mythology, and political propaganda. Each city develops its own stylistic identity while remaining part of a broader cultural system. And yet, beneath this brilliance, the structure of the world is not stable. Rivalries deepen, environmental pressures accumulate, population continues to grow. The same networks that once enabled expansion now carry the weight of increasing complexity and competition. The classical Maya world is at its peak, but it is also moving toward a threshold that will test every system it has built. As the great cities continue to rise, align, and compete, the balance between human ambition and environmental limitation begins to shift in subtle but increasingly important ways, setting the stage for the tensions that will eventually reshape the entire civilization. High above the jungle canopy, the sky opens in a way that feels almost deliberate, as if the ancient world itself is designed around celestial order. Stars emerge with a precision that never changes, while planets move in slow, predictable arcs across the night. For the classical Maya, this sky is not distant or abstract. It is a living system, deeply intertwined with human fate, political authority, and the structure of time itself. Before going deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In Maya cities, astronomy is not a separate discipline reserved for observation alone. It is embedded into architecture, ritual, and governance. Temples are aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Shadow patterns at specific times of year are used to mark ceremonial moments. Entire complexes are designed so that celestial events appear to interact with stone structures, turning the landscape into a vast instrument for tracking time. What survives in the archaeological record suggests a civilization that treated the sky not as background, but as blueprint. The Maya developed multiple calendar systems that operate simultaneously. The most famous is the long count, a linear system capable of tracking vast spans of time extending far beyond a human lifespan. Alongside it is the Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar, and the Harb, a 365-day solar cycle. These systems interlock in complex ways, creating repeating cycles that structure both daily life and long-term historical interpretation. Time is not simply measured, it is layered, cyclical, and symbolic. One of the lesser-known but crucial aspects of this system is how deeply it influences political legitimacy. Rulers do not merely govern in a temporal sense. They anchor their reigns within specific calendrical cycles believed to carry cosmic significance. Major events such as coronations, wars, and rituals are timed according to astronomical alignments. A ruler's authority is reinforced not only by lineage or military strength, but by alignment with the perceived order of the universe. The inscriptions carved into stone monuments reveal how carefully the Maya recorded historical events within this temporal framework. Dates are not approximate, they are precise, often tied to multiple calendar systems simultaneously. Battles between city-states are documented with exact timing, naming both victors and defeated rulers. These records allow modern archaeologists to reconstruct political histories with a level of detail rare in ancient civilizations, especially in the Americas. Yet despite this precision, gaps remain. Many inscriptions are eroded or incomplete. Some monuments were deliberately defaced in later periods, possibly during regime changes or political upheaval. The result is a fragmented historical record in which clarity and ambiguity coexist. Scholars still debate how to interpret certain events, especially when different cities present conflicting versions of the same conflict. Astronomical knowledge is particularly advanced in relation to Venus. The planet's cycles are tracked with remarkable accuracy, and its appearances are associated with warfare and transformation. Tables found in later codices show that Maya astronomers could predict Venus's movements with only a small margin of error. This level of precision suggests long-term observational records passed down across generations, carefully maintained within elite scholarly or priestly groups. What is less understood is how this knowledge was transmitted and preserved over centuries. The absence of surviving original codices from the classic period creates a major gap in understanding. Most surviving manuscripts were created later, during the post-classic era or shortly before Spanish contact. The earlier intellectual tradition must be reconstructed indirectly from stone inscriptions, architectural alignments, and fragmentary records. This limitation means that some aspects of Maya astronomy remain partially speculative, even if the overall system is well understood. Writing plays a central role in preserving this knowledge. The Maya script is one of the most complex writing systems in the ancient world, combining logographic and syllabic elements. It is capable of expressing abstract concepts, historical narratives, and detailed astronomical information. Each glyph block is a dense composition of meaning, often requiring multiple levels of interpretation. Decipherment of this script, achieved gradually over the 20th century, has transformed understanding of Maya civilization, revealing it to be far more politically dynamic and historically aware than earlier interpretations suggested. One of the most surprising discoveries from deciphered inscriptions is the level of historical consciousness among Maya elites. Kings and scribes were not only recording events, but actively shaping narratives about their past. Lineages are carefully constructed, sometimes linking rulers to mythological ancestors or celestial beings. History is not a neutral record. It is a tool of political legitimacy, used to reinforce authority and continuity. A lesser-known detail is that some inscriptions suggest awareness of very long time cycles, far beyond typical political horizons. References to dates far in the past, and even far in the future, indicate a conception of time that extends beyond human lifespans and dynastic limits. While interpretations of these references vary, they suggest a worldview in which civilization is embedded within vast cosmic rhythms. Astronomy, writing, and timekeeping are not separate achievements. They form a single integrated system. The sky is observed, translated into glyphs, and embedded into political and ritual structures. Time is measured, recorded, and used to structure both memory and expectation. In this system, nothing is random. Every event exists within a larger pattern of cycles, alignments, and repetitions. Yet even within this highly structured worldview, uncertainty persists. Astronomical tables are precise, but not immune to error. Political records are detailed, but often biased. Calendrical systems are sophisticated, but ultimately symbolic interpretations of natural cycles. What survives is an extraordinary intellectual framework, but one that still leaves gaps in understanding how it was experienced by ordinary people outside elite circles. The integration of these systems also reflects the broader structure of Maya society. Knowledge is concentrated within ruling elites, who combine political, religious, and scientific authority. This concentration of knowledge reinforces hierarchy, but also creates dependency. The stability of the system relies on the continuity of specialized knowledge transmission across generations, often within restricted social groups. As cities expand and political competition intensifies, this knowledge becomes even more valuable. Control over calendrical interpretation can influence decisions about war, agriculture, and ritual timing. In a world where celestial cycles are believed to reflect earthly fate, the ability to interpret the sky becomes a form of power. But this system, as sophisticated as it is, does not exist in isolation. It is deeply tied to environmental conditions, agricultural cycles, and political stability. When those foundations begin to shift, even the most precise systems of timekeeping and astronomy cannot fully prevent instability. The sky may remain constant, but the world beneath it does not. And as the classical Maya world continues to develop, the balance between cosmic order and earthly tension becomes increasingly fragile, setting the stage for rival powers to test not only each other, but the limits of the systems that have sustained their civilization for centuries. In the southern lowlands, the forest does not divide the world into isolation, it connects it. Beneath the dense canopy, rivers, ridgelines, and constructed causeways form invisible corridors linking city to city, ruler to ruler, ambition to ambition. By the height of the classic period, this landscape is no longer a collection of independent settlements. It is a contested arena where a small number of dominant powers exert influence over vast regions. pulling smaller polities into shifting webs of alliance, dependency, and rivalry. Before going deeper into this world of competition and control, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At the centre of this geopolitical landscape stand two towering powers, Tikal and Calakmul. They are not the only important cities, but they function as gravitational centres around which the political world reorganises itself again and again. Their rivalry spans centuries, shaping the destinies of dozens of subordinate cities. Smaller kingdoms are not merely independent actors. They're often drawn into the orbit of one superpower or the other, their rulers installed, removed, or supported depending on shifting alliances. Tikal, located in present-day northern Guatemala, rises from the jungle as one of the most visually striking urban centres of the ancient Americas. Its massive pyramids, particularly those of the Great Plaza and temple complexes, dominate the surrounding forest canopy. Archaeological evidence suggests that at its peak, Tikal supports a large population spread across a wide urban zone, connected by causeways and dense residential areas. Its political influence extends far beyond its immediate region, sustained through trade, military campaigns, and ideological authority. Calakmul, deep in the Yucatan Peninsula, is equally formidable, though more concealed within the landscape. Unlike Tikal's more open architectural visibility, Calakmul is embedded within a vast biosphere, its power expressed through control of regional networks rather than purely monumental display. It commands a wide alliance system often referred to by scholars as a superstate configuration, although the term remains debated. What is clear from inscriptions is that Calakmul actively installs and supports allied rulers in other cities, extending its influence through political engineering as much as direct conquest. The rivalry between these two powers is not a simple binary conflict. It is a long, fluctuating struggle that plays out over generations. Alliances shift repeatedly. Cities that once supported Tikal may later align with Calakmul, and vice versa. These changes are often recorded in stone monuments, where rulers proudly announce victories, captures, or new alliances. Yet the same cities may later be found under different influence, suggesting that political dominance is never permanent. One of the lesser-known aspects of this rivalry is how deeply it is tied to marriage alliances and dynastic relationships. Royal families interconnect through carefully arranged marriages that serve both diplomatic and strategic purposes. A marriage can secure trade routes, legitimize claims to territory, or stabilize fragile alliances, yet these relationships also create vulnerability. When dynastic lines fracture, entire political networks can destabilize rapidly. Warfare between these superpowers is frequent but highly structured. Battles are not always large-scale annihilations, but often targeted campaigns aimed at capturing rival nobles or installing proxy rulers. Inscriptions describe these events with precise dates and names, indicating that warfare is deeply integrated into the political and calendrical system. Victory is measured not only in territory, but in symbolic dominance, especially the capture of enemy elites, who are often displayed in ritual contexts. The inscriptions from Tikal and Calakmul reveal a propaganda war as much as a military one. Each city portrays itself as legitimate, divinely sanctioned, and victorious, while depicting its rival as illegitimate or weakened. This creates a layered historical record in which truth is filtered through competing political narratives. Modern scholars must carefully compare inscriptions from multiple sites to reconstruct more balanced accounts of events. At the same time, smaller city-states play a crucial role in this system. Cities such as Dos Pilas, Caracol, Naranjo, and Copan become key intermediaries in the struggle between the superpowers. Their rulers may shift allegiance multiple times over the course of a single generation. Some cities experience rapid cycles of rise and decline as they become entangled in larger geopolitical struggles. What appears as instability at the local level is often a reflection of broader regional competition. A striking detail from this period is the scale of indirect control exerted by the superpowers, rather than directly occupying territories. Tikal and Calakmul often establish influence through subordinate rulers. These client kings maintain local authority while aligning with the dominant patron. This system allows for expansive influence without requiring constant military occupation, but it also introduces instability, as loyalty can shift under pressure or opportunity. Environmental factors also intersect with political rivalry. Control over fertile agricultural zones, water sources, and trade routes becomes increasingly important as populations grow. Cities that can secure reliable access to resources gain strategic advantages. In some cases, military campaigns are launched not for ideological reasons, but to secure access to critical environmental zones. The line between political ambition and ecological necessity becomes increasingly blurred. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the most intense periods of conflict coincide with environmental stress. Extended drought periods, inferred from sediment cores and cave deposits, appear to overlap with phases of intensified warfare. While causation is difficult to establish definitively, the correlation suggests that environmental instability may amplify existing political tensions rather than act as a single trigger. Another lesser-known element of this rivalry is the role of monumental construction as political messaging. When a city achieves victory or establishes a new alliance, it often commemorates the event through new temples, stelae, or architectural modifications. These structures serve as permanent records of political achievement, embedding history into the physical landscape. Over time, the cities themselves become layered archives of political memory. Despite the intensity of competition, The system remains remarkably resilient for centuries. No single power achieves lasting unification of the lowlands. Instead, equilibrium is maintained through constant competition, shifting alliances, and periodic conflict. This balance is unstable but persistent, sustained by the interconnected nature of trade, ideology, and dynastic relationships. Yet beneath this apparent stability, pressure continues to accumulate. Population growth increases demand on agricultural systems, environmental modification intensifies, political rivalries deepen, creating cycles of retaliation and escalation. The very networks that sustain the system also transmit its vulnerabilities. By the end of this phase, the Maya lowlands are defined by a paradox. They are more interconnected than ever, yet also more politically fragmented. Power is concentrated in a few dominant centres, but constantly contested. The system is dynamic, sophisticated, and highly adaptive, but it is also increasingly sensitive to disruption. And as the rivalry between these superpowers intensifies, it begins to reshape not only political boundaries, but the deeper structures of society, environment, and survival itself, moving the classical Maya world toward a period where tension begins to outweigh stability. The forested lowlands are no longer just a stage for rivalry between distant superpowers. They are becoming a patchwork of tension, where conflict is no longer an occasional disruption, but a persistent condition shaping daily life. Roads that once carried traders now carry warriors. Ceremonial centres that once echoed with ritual gatherings begin to reflect a harsher rhythm of political instability. The Maya world, once defined by balanced competition, is shifting toward a more volatile and fragmented reality. Before going deeper into this transformation, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Warfare in the classic Maya world is not random violence, it is structured, symbolic, and deeply tied to political legitimacy. Battles are recorded with precision, often inscribed on stone monuments that commemorate victories, captures, and dynastic triumphs. Yet behind these formal records lies a more complex reality. Conflict is not always about annihilation, it is about control over people, over alliances, over symbolic authority, and over the fragile networks that bind cities together. As rivalry between major powers intensifies, smaller city-states become increasingly entangled in larger conflicts. Cities such as Dos Pilas, Naranjo, Caracol, and Yaxchilan are repeatedly drawn into shifting alliances. A single dynasty may find itself aligned with one superpower for a generation, only to be replaced or coerced into allegiance with another in the next. These rapid shifts create instability that ripples outward, affecting trade routes, agricultural production, and political legitimacy. One of the lesser-known but crucial aspects of Maya warfare is its focus on elite capture rather than total destruction. Victorious rulers often seek to capture rival nobles, particularly members of ruling dynasties. These captives are not always executed immediately. They may be displayed, interrogated, or incorporated into ritual events before their eventual fate is decided. The symbolic value of capturing a rival ruler can outweigh territorial gain, reinforcing the idea that warfare is as much about ideological dominance as physical conquest. Inscriptions from this period reveal a growing intensity in the language of conflict. Rulers describe themselves as Star War leaders, a term associated with celestial events interpreted as omens for warfare. These Star Wars are not cosmic battles, but timed military campaigns aligned with astronomical phenomena, particularly the cycles of Venus. The fusion of astronomy and warfare reflects a worldview in which celestial order and political action are inseparable. As conflicts escalate, fortifications begin to appear more frequently across the landscape. Some cities construct defensive walls, ditches, and strategically positioned settlements designed to monitor movement and control access routes. While not all cities are heavily fortified, the presence of such structures indicates a growing awareness of vulnerability. The Maya world is no longer only about ceremonial display and ritual authority. It is increasingly about defense, survival, and strategic control of territory. A striking detail often overlooked is how warfare reshapes settlement patterns. In some regions, populations begin to cluster in more defensible locations, such as hilltops or areas with natural barriers. Lowland centres that were once economically or ritually significant may be partially abandoned or reduced in importance as security concerns grow. This redistribution of population reflects a subtle but important shift in how space is organised in response to conflict. At the same time, the infrastructure of daily life becomes more militarised. Trade routes, once primarily economic corridors, increasingly require protection or alignment with dominant political powers. Markets continue to function, but they are now embedded within systems of tribute and control. Goods such as obsidian, jade, textiles, and cacao still circulate widely, but their movement is increasingly influenced by political alliances and military pressure. Environmental stress adds another layer of complexity to this escalating conflict. As populations grow, agricultural systems expand into marginal lands, forests are cleared at greater scale, and soil depletion becomes more pronounced in some regions. While these changes do not affect all areas equally, they create localized vulnerabilities that can be exploited during periods of political tension. In some cases, warfare may target not only cities but the agricultural hinterlands that sustain them. Sediment and pollen analysis from lake beds and cave systems suggests that several periods of intensified conflict coincide with episodes of reduced rainfall. These droughts, while not uniform across the entire region, would have placed significant strain on water-dependent agricultural systems. Reservoirs and water management structures become even more critical during such periods, and control over these resources becomes a strategic priority. Yet even sophisticated systems have limits when environmental conditions shift beyond expected ranges. Another lesser-known aspect of this period is the psychological dimension of prolonged warfare. Inscriptions and iconography suggest a growing emphasis on fear, intimidation, and symbolic domination. Public displays of captured elites, ritualized violence, and the destruction or desecration of monuments serve not only political purposes but also psychological ones. They reinforce the instability of alliances and the consequences of shifting loyalty. Despite the increasing intensity of conflict, the Maya world does not collapse into total war in the modern sense. Instead, it enters a state of sustained, multi-generational tension. Cities rise and fall in influence, but the overall system continues to function. Trade persists, ritual life continues, writing and astronomy remain central to elite identity. What changes is the balance between cooperation and coercion, which gradually tilts toward instability. A particularly revealing detail comes from the archaeological record of burned structures and abandoned settlements. In some cases, destruction appears localized rather than widespread, suggesting targeted raids or internal conflict rather than full-scale invasions. In other cases, entire neighborhoods are abandoned without clear evidence of violent destruction, pointing instead to social or political displacement. The evidence does not support a single uniform pattern of collapse, but rather a mosaic of different experiences across regions. As warfare intensifies, dynastic legitimacy becomes increasingly fragile. Rulers must constantly reinforce their authority through ritual performance, military success, and alignment with calendrical cycles. Failure in any of these domains can weaken political standing, making cities more vulnerable to external influence or internal dissent. The pressure on elite systems of governance grows steadily over time. By this stage, the Maya lowlands are defined by overlapping cycles of alliance, conflict, and reorganization. No single power achieves lasting dominance. Instead, authority is constantly negotiated through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and symbolic performance. The system remains highly sophisticated but also increasingly strained. And as conflict spreads more deeply into the fabric of daily life, it begins to interact with another, less visible force, one that does not originate from rival kings or shifting alliances, but from the environment itself, slowly altering the conditions under which this entire civilization must survive. The jungle does not reveal drought easily. Even when rain becomes scarce, the canopy still appears green from above, as if nothing has changed. But beneath that illusion of continuity, something fundamental begins to shift. Reservoirs shrink, soil hardens, seasonal cycles that once felt predictable start to falter, for a civilization built on the careful synchronization of agriculture, water management, and ritual timekeeping. Even subtle changes in rainfall patterns can ripple outward into every layer of society. Before going deeper into this unfolding environmental pressure, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The Maya lowlands are not a uniform environment. Some regions receive more rainfall than others, and some cities are better positioned to manage seasonal variation. Yet the classic Maya civilization as a whole is deeply dependent on the rhythm of wet and dry seasons. Agriculture, especially maize cultivation, relies on a delicate balance between rainfall and drainage. When that balance holds, cities thrive. When it shifts, even slightly, the consequences accumulate over time. Sediment cores extracted from lake beds across the Yucatan and Guatemala reveal layers that correspond to periods of reduced rainfall. Within these layers, chemical signatures indicate prolonged drought episodes during parts of the late Classic period. Cave formations, such as stalagmites, preserve similar signals in their growth patterns, recording shifts in precipitation over centuries. While these records do not point to a single catastrophic drought across the entire region, they do suggest repeated episodes of environmental stress occurring in relatively close succession. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that these droughts do not affect all regions equally. Some cities, particularly those with strong water storage systems, are able to endure longer dry periods. Others, especially those reliant on more direct rainfall agriculture, experience sharper disruption. This uneven impact begins to reshape political relationships. Cities with greater control over water infrastructure gain strategic importance, while others face increasing vulnerability. Water, already a symbol of political authority in earlier periods, becomes even more critical under these conditions. Reservoirs are expanded, maintained, and guarded with increasing care. Some cities integrate water systems directly into ceremonial architecture, reinforcing the idea that control over water is not only practical but sacred. Yet even the most advanced systems have limits. Extended dry cycles strain storage capacity, and contamination or evaporation can reduce usable supplies over time. One of the lesser-known but significant effects of prolonged drought is its impact on trade. As agricultural yields become less reliable in affected regions, surplus declines. This reduces the volume of goods available for exchange, particularly staples and agricultural products. Trade networks do not collapse immediately, but they begin to tighten, becoming more competitive and less reliable. Cities that once depended on steady exchange must now adapt to fluctuating availability. At the same time, population pressure continues to grow in many urban centres. The classic Maya world has already reached high levels of density in some regions, and this means that even small reductions in food production can create disproportionate stress. Storage systems buffer short-term fluctuations, but repeated drought cycles reduce their effectiveness. What begins as environmental variation slowly becomes a structural challenge to urban stability. Archaeological evidence from certain sites shows changes in construction patterns during this period. Some monumental projects are halted or scaled back. Residential areas show signs of shifting occupation, with some neighbourhoods abandoned while others become more densely populated. These patterns suggest internal reorganisation as cities attempt to adapt to changing resource availability. A particularly revealing detail comes from isotopic analysis of human remains. In some regions, dietary shifts can be detected over time, indicating increased reliance on drought-resistant crops or alternative food sources. This suggests that communities are not passive in the face of environmental change. They are actively adjusting agricultural strategies, diversifying production, and modifying consumption patterns. Yet these adaptations are uneven and may not be sufficient to offset broader climatic stress. The connection between drought and political instability is complex. There is no simple one-to-one relationship in which drought directly causes collapse. Instead, environmental stress interacts with existing political tensions, warfare, and economic competition. In some cases, drought may intensify rivalry between cities competing for limited resources. In others, it may weaken the ability of ruling elites to maintain authority, especially if they are seen as responsible for ensuring cosmic and environmental balance. Inscriptions and iconography from the late classic period sometimes reflect this growing sense of instability. While still framed within traditional cosmological language, there is an increased emphasis on ritual response to uncertainty. Rulers perform ceremonies intended to restore balance, ensure rainfall, or reinforce cosmic order. These rituals reflect a worldview in which environmental conditions are not separate from political legitimacy, but deeply intertwined with it. Yet despite these efforts, the underlying environmental patterns remain difficult to control. Drought cycles continue to recur, sometimes separated by short periods of recovery that may create a false sense of stability. This variability makes long-term planning more difficult. Agricultural systems that depend on consistent seasonal patterns become increasingly vulnerable to disruption. Another lesser-known aspect of this period is the possible role of regional variation in resilience. Some areas, particularly those with access to groundwater or more stable rainfall patterns, appear to experience less severe disruption. These regions may become relative centres of stability, even as surrounding areas face greater stress. This uneven resilience contributes to shifting population movement, as people may relocate toward more reliable zones over time. The interaction between drought and warfare also becomes more pronounced. Competition over fertile land, water access, and trade routes intensifies under conditions of scarcity. While conflict is already a structural feature of the classic Maya world, environmental stress adds new pressure points. Some cities may find themselves caught between ecological limitation and political rivalry, compounding their vulnerability. Yet even in this period of increasing strain, the system does not immediately break. The Maya world remains functional, adaptive, and culturally vibrant. Cities continue to build monuments, record inscriptions, and engage in complex political relationships. The presence of drought does not erase civilization. Instead, it reshapes the conditions under which that civilization operates, gradually altering its internal balance. What becomes increasingly clear is that environmental stress alone cannot fully explain what is unfolding. Drought interacts with existing systems of warfare, political fragmentation, population density, and resource distribution. It is one force among many, but a powerful one, especially when repeated over time. The cumulative effect is what matters most. As these environmental pressures continue to build, they begin to intersect more directly with the human systems that depend on them. Cities are no longer only responding to political rivals or managing internal governance. They're also adapting to a landscape whose stability is no longer guaranteed. And in this growing uncertainty, the foundations of the classical Maya world begin to show their first visible signs of strain. The forest is not disappearing in a single dramatic moment. It is thinning slowly, almost imperceptibly across generations. From the ground, the change is difficult to notice day by day, but from the perspective of centuries, the transformation becomes unmistakable. Where once dense canopies stretched uninterrupted across the lowlands, now there are expanding clearings, managed fields, and landscapes increasingly shaped by human hands. The Maya world is not only living within the jungle, it is gradually rewriting it. Before going deeper into this transformation, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, agriculture is the foundation of Maya civilization, and maize sits at its centre, alongside beans, squash, and other crops. It supports the dense populations of the classic period, but maize cultivation requires land, and land requires clearing. Over time, the demand for food to sustain growing urban centres pushes agriculture further into surrounding forests. Trees are cut, burned, and replaced with fields that initially yield abundant harvest but gradually alter the ecological balance. One of the lesser-known but important aspects of this process is that Maya agriculture is not uniform. It includes a range of techniques: slash-and-burn cultivation, raised fields and wetlands, terracing on slopes, and managed forest gardens. This diversity allows for remarkable adaptability, but it also means that different regions experience environmental pressure in different ways. Some systems recover quickly after cycles of use, while others degrade more rapidly under repeated cultivation. Soil fertility becomes a central concern over time. In tropical environments, heavy rainfall can leach nutrients from soil, making sustained agriculture more challenging without careful management. The Maya developed techniques to mitigate this, including crop rotation, fallowing, and the use of organic matter to maintain soil structure. Yet as population increases, the fallow periods needed for soil recovery become shorter, reducing the long-term sustainability of some agricultural zones. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence suggests that deforestation intensifies during the Classic period, particularly around major urban centres. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows shifts in vegetation, with decreases in tree species and increases in disturbance-tolerant plants. Charcoal deposits indicate increased burning activity, consistent with land clearing for agriculture. These patterns do not point to ecological collapse in a single moment, but a sustained and expanding human impact on the environment. As forests recede, the consequences extend beyond agriculture. Deforestation affects local climate conditions, including rainfall distribution and soil moisture retention. While the full extent of these effects remains debated, some models suggest that large-scale forest loss can contribute to reduced local precipitation and increased temperature variability. In a system already sensitive to drought cycles, even modest environmental feedback could amplify stress. Urban centres feel these changes in indirect but important ways. Water systems become more strained as rainfall patterns shift. Reservoirs must compensate not only for seasonal variation, but for longer-term changes in hydrology. In some cities, engineering efforts intensify, with expanded storage systems and more complex water management infrastructure. Yet these systems require maintenance, labour, and stable governance to function effectively. One of the lesser-known but revealing details from this period is the evidence of increasing labour demands associated with agricultural intensification. As land becomes more heavily used, maintaining productivity requires more effort per unit of output. Terraces must be maintained, soils enriched, and water systems managed carefully. This increases the burden on both rural populations and the urban centres that depend on them. At the same time, population density continues to rise in many regions during the late Classic period. Cities grow larger, and surrounding agricultural zones are pushed closer to their ecological limits. This creates a feedback loop in which increased demand leads to greater land use, which in turn increases environmental pressure, which then requires even more careful management to sustain output. In some areas, evidence suggests that agricultural expansion moves into less optimal land, including steeper slopes or more marginal soils. These areas can be productive under careful management, but they are more vulnerable to erosion and long-term degradation. Over time, this may reduce overall agricultural resilience, even if short-term production remains stable. The connection between deforestation and political stability is subtle but important. Agricultural surplus is not just a matter of survival, it is the basis of political power. Rulers depend on surplus extraction to support elites, fund construction projects, and maintain ritual systems. As environmental conditions become more variable, maintaining that surplus becomes increasingly difficult, placing pressure on political institutions. Another lesser-known aspect of this process is the role of elite consumption patterns. Archaeological evidence from palaces and elite residences shows concentrations of imported goods, luxury items, and specialized foods. While these do not necessarily indicate excessive consumption in modern terms, they do reflect a system in which surplus is unevenly distributed. During periods of environmental stress, such inequalities may become more visible and potentially more politically sensitive. Deforestation also alters settlement patterns in less obvious ways. As forests are cleared, previously uninhabited or lightly used areas become accessible for agriculture and settlement. This can lead to expansion into new zones, but also to fragmentation of older ecological systems. In some cases, cities may become more dispersed, with satellite communities developing around core urban centres. Despite these pressures, Maya agricultural systems demonstrate significant resilience. The diversity of techniques allows for adaptation across different environmental conditions. Some regions continue to support dense populations even under changing ecological circumstances. This resilience is one of the reasons the civilization persists for centuries despite growing challenges. However, resilience does not mean immunity. The system becomes increasingly dependent on continuous maintenance and coordination. Small disruptions in rainfall, soil fertility, or labour organisation can have amplified effects. The balance between productivity and sustainability becomes more delicate over time. What emerges from the archaeological record is not a sudden ecological collapse, but a long process of intensification and strain. Forests are not destroyed overnight. They are gradually integrated into a managed landscape that supports civilization, but also transforms its environmental foundation. The Maya are not separate from their ecosystem. They are actively reshaping it, and in doing so, altering the conditions of their own survival. As agricultural strain increases, it interacts with other pressures already present in the system: drought cycles, warfare, and political competition. These forces do not operate independently. They reinforce one another in complex ways, creating a multi-layered set of challenges that gradually reshape the stability of the classic Maya world. And as the landscape continues to change under the combined weight of human activity and environmental variability, the cities that once defined the region begin to face a new and unsettling reality. The foundations that sustain their growth are no longer as reliable as they once were. The silence arrives gradually, but its effects are abrupt in the archaeological record. cities that once anchored vast networks of trade, ritual, and political power begin to lose their density. Courtyards that once filled with movement grow still. Palaces that once echoed with ceremony and governance fall into disuse. Then, over time, the jungle begins its quiet advance, reclaiming plazas, stairways, and temples until only stone silhouettes remain beneath the canopy. Before going deeper into this transition, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes this moment so compelling in the historical record is not a single uniform collapse, but a pattern of abandonment that unfolds unevenly across the southern lowlands. Some cities are left rapidly, with minimal signs of prolonged occupation afterward. Others decline more slowly, with populations thinning over decades or even generations. There is no single moment that marks the end. Instead, there is a broad regional shift in which the centres of power, culture, and population gradually move elsewhere. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Tikal, Palenque, and Copan shows a noticeable reduction in monument construction during the Terminal Classic period. Stelae that once recorded the deeds of kings become less frequent. In some cases, the last dated inscriptions appear with striking precision, after which the historical record falls silent. This absence is not just a loss of text, it reflects a deeper transformation in political organisation and urban life. One of the lesser-known but significant patterns observed at these sites is the abandonment of elite residential compounds before the full depopulation of surrounding areas. This suggests that political centres may have been vacated first, followed by gradual dispersal of broader populations. In some cases, common residential zones show continued occupation even after royal courts have ceased functioning, indicating a fragmentation of authority rather than an immediate societal disappearance. The reasons for this shift are not singular. Environmental stress, particularly prolonged drought cycles, continues to play a role. Agricultural strain from deforestation and soil exhaustion adds further pressure. Warfare between competing city-states destabilizes alliances and disrupts trade networks. These factors do not operate in isolation, they interact, reinforcing one another in ways that gradually reduce the resilience of urban systems. Water management systems, once a source of strength, become increasingly vulnerable under extended dry conditions. Reservoirs that were carefully engineered to sustain populations during seasonal variation struggle to cope with multi-year drought episodes. In some cities, evidence suggests that water storage capacity was expanded repeatedly in response to stress, but even these efforts have limits when rainfall patterns fail to recover. Trade networks also begin to contract. As political instability increases, long-distance exchange becomes less reliable. Goods such as obsidian, jade, and cacao still circulate, but with greater variability and uncertainty. Some cities lose access to key resources entirely, forcing changes in production and consumption patterns. The weakening of trade further reduces political cohesion, as alliances become harder to maintain without consistent material exchange. Another lesser-known aspect of this period is the evidence of internal reorganisation within cities before abandonment. In some sites, architectural modifications suggest attempts to adapt to changing conditions. Structures are repurposed, spaces are redefined, and urban layouts shift in response to declining populations or changing political priorities. These changes indicate that abandonment is not always sudden collapse, but often a process of adaptation followed by gradual withdrawal. At the same time, there is evidence of increased fortification and defensive construction in some regions. Walls, ditches, and restricted access points appear more frequently in late contexts. This suggests that as resources become more limited, competition and insecurity increase. However, these defensive measures do not appear sufficient to stabilise the system in the long term. A particularly revealing detail comes from settlement patterns in surrounding rural zones. As major centres decline, populations do not disappear entirely. Instead, they often disperse into smaller, more flexible communities. These smaller settlements may be better suited to managing environmental variability and resource scarcity. In some regions, this dispersal appears to represent a strategic adaptation rather than a simple collapse. Yet the symbolic heart of the civilization, the monumental cities, does not recover. Once abandoned, the great ceremonial centres are not reoccupied at their former scale. Over time, they become overgrown, their architectural significance preserved only in stone and memory. The jungle does not erase them quickly, but it does obscure them effectively, transforming them from living cities into archaeological traces. One of the most striking and lesser-known observations from this period is the uneven timing of abandonment across regions. The southern lowlands experienced significant decline earlier than some northern areas. This geographic variation suggests that local environmental conditions, political structures, and resource availability all play roles in determining resilience. The collapse is not uniform, it is patchy, staggered, and regionally differentiated. Inscriptions from the final phases of some cities carry a tone of increasing uncertainty. While still framed within traditional cosmology, there is a noticeable shift in emphasis toward ritual efforts to restore balance and stability. This reflects a growing awareness that established systems are under strain. However, these inscriptions do not describe collapse in explicit terms. Instead, they continue to operate within established narrative frameworks, even as the material conditions they reflect are changing. By the end of this process, many of the great southern cities are largely abandoned or significantly reduced in scale. The political landscape that once revolved around powerful urban centres is no longer organised in the same way. Authority becomes more fragmented and population centres shift toward different regions. Yet what remains most important is that this is not the disappearance of a people, it is the transformation of a system. The population does not vanish, it relocates, reorganises, and adapts to new conditions. What collapses is a specific model of urban civilization based on dense city-states, monumental architecture, and centralised ritual authority. As the southern lowlands fall quiet, attention begins to shift toward regions that continue to maintain stronger levels of stability. In these areas, new centres of power begin to emerge, reshaping the cultural and political map of the Maya world in ways that will define its later history. The silence left behind in the southern lowlands does not spread evenly across the Maya world. It concentrates, almost like a shadow that moves away from one region and gathers in another. While many of the great southern cities fall into decline, other regions begin to reorganize themselves around different centers of power. The northern Yucatan Peninsula, once less dominant in the classical political landscape, starts to rise in importance, not through sudden conquest, but through gradual structural adaptation to changing conditions. Before going deeper into this shift, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the cities that emerge or strengthen in the north, such as Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and later Mayapan, reflect a different political and cultural configuration compared to the southern lowland kingdoms. The monumental dynastic systems of earlier classic Maya cities, with their tightly documented royal lineages and deeply personalised kingship, begin to transform. Authority becomes less centred on individual divine kings and more distributed among elite groups, councils, or shared ruling structures. This is not a simple replacement, but a reorganisation of how power is expressed and maintained. One of the lesser-known but significant environmental differences shaping this shift is water availability. Unlike the southern lowlands, which rely heavily on rainfall and complex reservoir systems, parts of the northern Yucatan benefit from a more stable network of underground water sources known as cenotes. These natural sinkholes provide access to fresh water in an otherwise dry limestone landscape. This geological feature becomes a critical factor in supporting sustained settlement, even during periods of regional drought. Archaeological evidence suggests that northern cities develop architectural and ceremonial traditions that reflect both continuity with earlier Maya culture and adaptation to new political realities. Monumental structures still dominate the landscape, but their arrangement and symbolic emphasis begin to shift. At Chichen Itza, for example, architectural styles show influences from central Mexican cultures, indicating increased interaction and exchange beyond traditional Maya boundaries. This blending of cultural influences is one of the most debated aspects of the post-classic transition. Some scholars interpret it as evidence of migration or external influence from highland Mexico, possibly linked to groups associated with Tula and the broader Toltec cultural sphere. Others argue for a more complex model of long-distance interaction, trade, and shared ideology, rather than direct conquest or replacement. What survives in the material record suggests contact and influence. But the exact nature of these relationships remains uncertain. What is clear is that northern centres operate within a different political logic than many of the earlier southern city-states. While dynastic kingship does not disappear entirely, there is a noticeable shift toward more collective forms of governance in some regions. Power may be distributed among elite councils or shared among competing noble lineages, reducing the extreme concentration of authority seen in earlier classic period dynasties. Trade networks also evolve during this period. Long-distance exchange becomes increasingly important, connecting the northern Yucatan with central Mexico and coastal regions. Goods such as obsidian, ceramics, textiles, and prestige items circulate through these networks, carrying not only material value but also cultural and ideological influence. The Maya world is no longer primarily inward-facing, it is increasingly embedded in broader Mesoamerican interaction spheres. One of the lesser-known but important developments in this period is the changing role of ritual spaces. Sacred architecture continues to be central to urban identity, but the emphasis of ritual practice begins to shift. Public ceremonies remain important, yet there is evidence that some rituals become more centralized or restricted to elite groups. This may reflect broader changes in political organization. Where authority is maintained through controlled access to sacred knowledge rather than purely dynastic representation. Despite these shifts, continuity remains strong in many aspects of Maya culture. The calendar systems persist, though their political significance evolves. Writing continues to be used, though with regional variation in style and frequency. Artistic traditions adapt but do not disappear. This continuity challenges any simplistic notion of cultural collapse. Instead, what emerges is a long process of transformation, where older systems are reinterpreted within new political and environmental contexts. However, the northern regions are not immune to the broader pressures affecting the Maya world. Evidence suggests that environmental variability, including periodic drought conditions, continues to affect agricultural production even in areas with more stable water access. While cenotes provide resilience, they do not fully eliminate the challenges of supporting large populations. Resource management remains a critical concern. At the same time, political competition does not disappear. Northern cities still engage in rivalry, alliance building, and occasional conflict. The difference is not the absence of instability, but its reconfiguration. Instead of the dense dynastic warfare of the southern classic period, political dynamics in the north appear more fluid and less tied to long hereditary lineages. A particularly revealing detail from archaeological studies at Chichen Itza is the presence of large-scale communal and ceremonial spaces that differ in organisation from earlier classic Maya cities. Structures such as the Great Ball Court and the Temple of the Warriors suggest new forms of public interaction, possibly reflecting changes in how authority and community identity are expressed. These spaces are not simply religious or political, they are integrated arenas of social coordination. The famous bull game itself continues to play an important role during this period. While its exact meanings likely vary across time and region, it remains deeply embedded in ritual, politics, and identity. In some contexts, it may symbolise cosmic struggle or serve as a mechanism for resolving conflict. Its continued prominence underscores the endurance of shared cultural frameworks, even as political systems evolve. Yet beneath these continuities, there is a subtle but important shift in scale. The monumental intensity of the classic southern cities, with their dense dynastic inscriptions and tightly documented royal histories, gives way to a more regionally diverse and less centralised cultural landscape. Power is no longer concentrated in the same way, and historical memory becomes more fragmented across different centres. One of the lesser-known consequences of this shift is how it affects the preservation of historical records. Fewer dynastic inscriptions mean fewer detailed accounts of political events in the northern post-classic world compared to the classic southern cities. This creates a gap in the historical record that modern archaeology must reconstruct through architecture, material culture, and limited textual evidence. As the northern centres rise, they do not simply replace the southern cities. Instead, they represent a reconfiguration of the Maya world under new conditions. Environmental stress, political fragmentation, and shifting trade networks all contribute to this transformation. The civilization does not end, it reorganises itself in response to changing realities. And as these northern cities continue to develop their own cultural and political identities, they also begin to intersect with forces from outside the traditional Maya sphere, introducing new influences that will further reshape the trajectory of the region's history. By the time northern centres such as Chichen Itza reach their height, the Maya world is no longer an isolated cultural sphere. It is increasingly entangled in a wider Mesoamerican web of exchange, migration, and ideological influence. The boundaries that once defined distinct regional traditions begin to blur, not through sudden conquest alone, but through centuries of contact, trade, and political negotiation across vast distances. Before going deeper into this transformation, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, one of the most debated influences on the post-classic Maya world comes from central Mexico, particularly from the region associated with the city of Tula and the broader Toltec cultural tradition. Archaeological similarities between Chichen Itza and central Mexican sites appear in architectural styles, iconography, and certain artistic motifs. Feathered serpent imagery, warrior columns, and distinct pyramid layouts suggest a shared symbolic vocabulary, though the exact nature of this relationship remains uncertain. Some interpretations propose direct migration, or even political domination by external groups, suggesting that Toltec elites may have established influence or control over parts of the northern Yucatan. Others argue for a more complex model of long-distance interaction, where ideas, styles, and religious concepts move through trade networks and elite exchange, rather than through large-scale population replacement. What survives in the archaeological record supports contact and influence, but does not provide a single clear narrative of conquest or integration. One of the lesser-known but significant aspects of this period is the role of pilgrimage and sacred geography. Certain sites, especially Chichen Itza, appear to function not only as political centres, but also as religious destinations attracting visitors from distant regions. Cenotes, sacred wells, and ceremonial complexes become focal points for ritual activity that extends beyond local communities. These spaces may serve as points of convergence where different cultural traditions interact and merge. Trade networks during this period expand in both scale and complexity. Goods such as obsidian from highland Mexico, jade from distant regions, marine shells from coastal zones, and finely crafted ceramics circulate through interconnected systems. These exchanges carry not only material value but also symbolic and ideological significance. Objects become carriers of identity, authority, and cosmological meaning across cultural boundaries. At the same time, political organisation in some northern centres appears to reflect new forms of authority. Rather than the strictly dynastic kingship of the classic southern cities, some post-classic systems show evidence of more shared or segmented power structures. Elite councils, military orders, or competing noble factions may play a greater role in governance. This does not eliminate kingship entirely, but it reshapes how authority is distributed and maintained. A particularly revealing detail from Chichen Itza is the presence of architectural and iconographic elements that emphasize militarization. Warrior imagery becomes more prominent in sculpture and reliefs. Columns depicting armed figures, processional spaces, and large ceremonial plazas suggest a society in which military identity is closely tied to political legitimacy. However, this emphasis does not necessarily indicate constant warfare, but rather the symbolic importance of martial power in elite ideology. Despite these external influences and internal transformations, Maya cultural continuity remains strong. The calendar systems, ritual frameworks, and linguistic traditions persist across regions. Writing continues to be used in some areas, although its distribution becomes more uneven than in the classic period. Some regions maintain strong scribal traditions, while others rely more heavily on oral transmission and symbolic representation. One of the lesser-known but important consequences of increased external contact is the gradual fragmentation of historical narratives. In the Classic period, dense dynastic inscriptions provided relatively continuous records of political events in major cities. In the post-Classic world, these records become less consistent. The result is a more fragmented historical landscape, where continuity must be reconstructed from scattered inscriptions, architectural patterns, and later colonial accounts. This fragmentation is further complicated by the arrival of Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, who encounter a world already transformed by centuries of internal change and external influence. The narratives they record are shaped by translation, interpretation, and the political realities of conquest. Indigenous accounts are filtered through linguistic and cultural barriers, and many original written sources are destroyed or lost in the early colonial period. One of the most significant losses occurs with the destruction of Maya codices, folded books made from bark paper that contained astronomical tables, ritual information, and historical records. Only a few survive today, preserved in fragmentary form. The vast majority are burned or destroyed during colonial campaigns, particularly under the justification of eliminating idolatrous knowledge. This loss creates a profound gap in understanding the intellectual world of the post-classic and earlier periods. As a result, much of what is known about Maya civilization is reconstructed from incomplete sources. Archaeology provides material evidence, inscriptions offer partial narratives, and colonial accounts add another layer of interpretation. Each source carries its own limitations and biases. The challenge for modern scholarship is not only to interpret what remains, but to understand what has been irretrievably lost. Another lesser-known aspect of this period is how memory itself becomes contested. Different regions preserve different versions of history, often shaped by local political needs and later reinterpretations. Some traditions emphasize continuity with earlier classic dynasties, while others highlight new origins or external connections. This multiplicity of narratives reflects a broader transformation in how history is recorded and transmitted. Environmental factors continue to play a background role during this period of cultural interaction and change. While northern centres benefit from more stable water sources, they are not entirely insulated from regional climate variability. Agricultural production still depends on seasonal patterns, and periods of drought or instability can affect local populations. However, the impact is distributed differently than in the southern lowlands, contributing to regional variation in resilience. By this stage, the Maya world is no longer defined by a single political or cultural system. It is a layered landscape of traditions, influences, and adaptations. Southern classic cities have largely declined or transformed. Northern centres are interacting with external cultures, regional diversity increases, and with it, the complexity of historical interpretation. And as these influences continue to intersect, merge, and fragment, the Maya world moves further away from its earlier classical structure, entering a period in which its identity is no longer defined by a single dominant centre, but by a shifting mosaic of interconnected yet distinct traditions. The world that Spanish ships eventually encounter on the edges of the Maya realm is already a transformed one. The great classic cities of the southern lowlands are no longer active centres of political power. What remains is a patchwork of northern polities, fragmented kingdoms, and deeply rooted cultural traditions that still carry echoes of an older, more densely organised civilization. But the arrival of European forces introduces a disruption of a different scale entirely, one that does not simply shift power, but actively dismantles systems of memory, governance, and cultural transmission. Before going deeper into this collapse of continuity, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The Spanish encounter the Maya world through multiple phases, beginning with coastal contact and gradually expanding inland. Early impressions are often shaped by confusion and underestimation. The complexity of Maya society is not immediately recognised in full, partly due to linguistic barriers and partly due to the fragmented political landscape already in place. What appears to European observers as a series of dispersed settlements is, in reality, the remnants of a far more intricate historical system. One of the lesser-known but important aspects of this period is that Maya societies do not present a single unified response to Spanish arrival. Instead, different city-states and regional powers react in varied ways. Some engage in resistance, others attempt strategic alliances, and some are drawn into conflicts that predate European contact. The fragmentation that had already developed in the post-classic world becomes a key factor in how conquest unfolds. Military encounters between Spanish forces and Maya polities are often characterized by asymmetry in technology and tactics, but not by immediate or uniform collapse. In some regions, Maya groups mount prolonged resistance, using knowledge of terrain, fortified settlements, and guerrilla-style tactics. The jungle environment, which had shaped Maya civilization for millennia, also becomes a strategic factor in resisting external control. Yet over time, disease, political fragmentation, and sustained military pressure begin to erode organised resistance. One of the most devastating and least visible forces during this period is disease. Epidemics introduced through European contact spread rapidly through populations with no prior exposure or immunity. These outbreaks significantly reduce population levels in many areas, often before direct military confrontation occurs. The demographic impact is severe and uneven, weakening social structures and accelerating disruption of local systems of governance and labour. As Spanish colonial control expands, It targets not only political authority but also cultural infrastructure. Indigenous systems of governance are replaced or subordinated under colonial administration. Traditional leadership structures are disrupted, and new forms of authority are imposed. This transformation is not instantaneous, but it steadily undermines the continuity of older political systems that had already been evolving for centuries. One of the most significant and irreversible losses occurs in the realm of writing and recorded knowledge. Maya codices, which contained astronomical data, ritual instructions, and historical narratives, are systematically destroyed in many areas. Spanish missionaries, viewing these texts as incompatible with Christian doctrine, often burn them during campaigns of religious conversion. Only a handful of codices survive into the modern era, preserving fragments of a vast intellectual tradition. The destruction of these texts creates a profound rupture in historical continuity. Without written records, much of the detailed internal history of Maya city-states becomes inaccessible. What survives is a combination of archaeological evidence, oral traditions, and colonial accounts written from external perspectives. This fragmented record shapes how later generations reconstruct Maya civilization, often leaving gaps that can never be fully recovered. Another lesser-known aspect of cultural disruption is the transformation of sacred spaces. Many ancient ceremonial centres are repurposed, abandoned, or reinterpreted under colonial influence. Some are physically dismantled for construction materials, while others are redefined within new religious frameworks. The symbolic landscape of the Maya world is not only altered physically, but also reinterpreted ideologically. Despite this, cultural continuity does not disappear entirely. In many regions, Maya communities continue to preserve language, agricultural practices, calendrical knowledge, and ritual traditions. These elements adapt to new conditions rather than vanishing outright. The result is a complex process of cultural persistence under changing political and social structures. What changes is not only survival, but the context in which survival occurs. One of the lesser-known but crucial dynamics of this period is the role of indigenous intermediaries. Some Maya groups engage with colonial systems in ways that allow partial preservation of local autonomy or cultural practice. Others resist more directly, while still others are incorporated into colonial labour and administrative systems. These varied responses reflect a landscape of adaptation rather than uniform submission. Over time, colonial pressures reshape settlement patterns again. Populations are relocated, often into newly organised towns or mission centres. This restructuring disrupts older spatial relationships between cities, agricultural zones, and ceremonial landscapes. The physical geography of Maya life is reorganised under external authority, further distancing communities from the spatial logic of earlier civilizations. Yet even within this transformed environment, traces of the ancient world remain embedded in daily life. Agricultural techniques continue, sometimes unchanged, sometimes adapted. Calendrical knowledge persists in modified forms. Oral traditions preserve fragments of historical memory, though often reshaped by later interpretations and external influences. The ancient world is not erased entirely, but it is reframed within new historical conditions. A particularly revealing detail from this period is how memory becomes layered. Indigenous accounts of history are preserved alongside colonial narratives, creating overlapping versions of the past. Some elements are aligned, while others diverge significantly. This creates a complex historical record in which truth is not singular, but distributed across multiple perspectives. As colonial systems consolidate, the physical remnants of earlier Maya civilization begin to attract curiosity from European observers. Ruins that had been partially known or locally remembered become subjects of documentation and study. However, early interpretations are often limited by misunderstanding of the scale and sophistication of what remains. The ruins are seen as remnants of a vanished civilization, rather than evidence of a long process of transformation. This perception contributes to a narrative of disappearance that oversimplifies the historical reality. The Maya do not vanish, they persist, adapt, and transform. But the continuity between ancient cities and modern communities becomes obscured by layers of political, cultural, and historical disruption. By the end of this period, the Maya world is fundamentally reshaped. Its political systems are dismantled or transformed, its written records are largely lost, its sacred landscapes are reinterpreted, yet its cultural presence continues in altered but enduring forms. What has changed is not the existence of the Maya, but the framework through which their history is understood and recorded. And as colonial transformation settles over the region, attention slowly begins to shift centuries later toward the rediscovery of what once was a process that will attempt to reconstruct a lost world from fragments scattered across stone, jungle, and memory. For centuries after the great cities fall silent beneath the jungle canopy, the ruins remain largely hidden from the outside world. Locals live among them, sometimes using stones from ancient structures in new buildings, sometimes preserving oral traditions that hint at a deeper past. But for much of global history, the scale and sophistication of the Maya civilization remains only partially understood, filtered through fragmented accounts and misunderstood ruins. It is not until the gradual rise of archaeology that the lost world begins to reassemble itself piece by piece. Before going deeper into this rediscovery, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, early European explorers who encounter Maya ruins often struggle to interpret what they are seeing. Dense vegetation hides entire cities, and what emerges from the forest appears at first as isolated temples or strange stone formations. Without the broader context of urban networks, trade systems, and political organisation, early interpretations tend to underestimate the complexity of what once existed. Some even imagine that these structures were built by lost civilizations unrelated to the indigenous peoples still living in the region, a misconception that reflects both limited information and colonial bias. One of the lesser-known but important developments in the rediscovery process is how slowly the scale of Maya civilization becomes visible. Early accounts focus on individual sites, such as Palenque or Copan, but do not yet reveal the vast interconnected network of cities beneath the forest canopy. It is only with sustained exploration, mapping, and later technological advances that the full extent of the civilization begins to emerge. In the 19th century, systematic expeditions begin to document Maya ruins in greater detail. Explorers, artists, and early archaeologists travel through difficult terrain, recording architectural features, copying inscriptions, and collecting artifacts. These early efforts are often limited by technology and interpretation, but they lay the groundwork for later scientific archaeology. Drawings of carved stelae, pyramids, and glyphic panels become crucial records, especially for monuments that are later damaged or eroded. One of the most significant breakthroughs in understanding Maya civilization comes from the gradual decipherment of its writing system. For a long time, Maya glyphs are assumed to be purely symbolic or astronomical, with little connection to historical narrative. This interpretation begins to change in the 20th century as scholars identify phonetic elements within the script. Over time, it becomes clear that the glyphs record detailed historical accounts, including dynastic lineages, political conflicts, and precise dates of events. This decipherment transforms the entire understanding of Maya civilization. What once appeared to be a mysterious ceremonial culture is revealed to be a deeply historical society with recorded kings, wars, alliances, and political strategies. The inscriptions show that Maya rulers were actively engaged in shaping history, not merely performing ritual roles. The civilization becomes visible not only as an archaeological phenomenon, but as a documented historical system. Another lesser-known but crucial advancement in Maya studies is the introduction of aerial and satellite-based technologies. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, LIDAR scanning revolutionizes the study of ancient landscapes. By penetrating the forest canopy, LIDAR reveals the true extent of urban development across the lowlands. Entire networks of roads, terraces, residential zones, and defensive structures emerge from what was previously thought to be largely uninhabited jungle. These findings fundamentally change earlier assumptions about population density and urban planning. The Maya world is revealed to be far more extensive and densely organized than previously believed. Cities are not isolated centers, but parts of vast interconnected systems. Agricultural modification of the landscape is also far more widespread, showing that large portions of the environment were actively managed and reshaped over centuries. One of the most striking discoveries from modern archaeology is the complexity of Maya water management systems. Reservoirs, canals, and catchment structures are found integrated into urban and rural landscapes. Some of these systems are far more sophisticated than earlier interpretations suggested, indicating long-term planning and engineering knowledge adapted to seasonal and climatic variability. These discoveries help explain how large populations were sustained in environments previously thought to be marginal. At the same time, archaeological research reveals the diversity of Maya society. Far from being uniform, the civilization consists of multiple regional traditions, political systems, and architectural styles. Differences between northern and southern regions, coastal and inland cities, and highland and lowland areas become increasingly clear. This diversity challenges earlier ideas of a single monolithic Maya culture, replacing it with a more complex model of interconnected but distinct societies. One of the lesser-known insights from archaeological research is the extent to which ordinary life can now be reconstructed. Household remains, cooking areas, storage pits, and everyday tools provide evidence of daily routines that complement the monumental record of kings and temples. This broader perspective reveals a society not only of rulers and elites, but of farmers, artisans, traders, and labourers who form the foundation of the civilization. Despite these advances, significant gaps remain. Many regions are still only partially explored, and large portions of the archaeological record remain buried or inaccessible. Preservation conditions vary widely, and organic materials such as textiles, wood, and manuscripts are often lost to time. As a result, the reconstructed history is still incomplete, shaped by what survives rather than what once existed in full. Another important dimension of rediscovery is the role of indigenous knowledge. In many cases, local communities preserve oral traditions, place names, and cultural practices that provide valuable clues to understanding ancient sites. These perspectives often challenge or enrich archaeological interpretations, highlighting the importance of integrating multiple sources of knowledge in reconstructing the past. At the same time, modern archaeology must also confront the legacy of earlier misinterpretations and colonial assumptions. Early theories that disconnected Maya civilization from its indigenous descendants have been widely discredited, but their influence persists in some historical narratives. Correcting these misconceptions is part of the ongoing process of reconstructing a more accurate and respectful understanding of Maya history. By the present day, the rediscovery of the Maya world has transformed it from a lost civilization into one of the most intensively studied ancient societies in the Americas. Yet even with advanced technology and decades of research, the picture remains incomplete. New discoveries continue to reshape understanding, revealing unexpected complexity in political organization, environmental adaptation, and cultural continuity. And as the archaeological record expands, a deeper question begins to emerge, not simply what happened to the ancient Maya cities, but how a civilization of such scale and sophistication could transform so completely, leaving behind a landscape that appears both richly documented and still fundamentally unresolved. Even after decades of excavation, satellite mapping, and decipherment of inscriptions, the Maya world still resists a single, unified explanation for its transformation. The story that emerges is not one of simple disappearance, but of layered change unfolding across centuries, where environmental pressure, political fragmentation, warfare, and social reorganization interact in ways that never fully align into one clear cause. What remains is a civilization that does not so much vanish, as it slowly reconfigures itself into new forms that are harder to recognize from the outside. Before going deeper into this final reflection, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the most important conclusions of modern scholarship is that the so-called collapse of the classic Maya civilization is not a uniform event. Different regions experience different trajectories. Some southern lowland cities are abandoned relatively quickly over a few generations. Others decline more gradually, maintaining partial occupation or reduced political significance for longer periods. Meanwhile, northern centres continue to develop and adapt, showing that civilization itself does not end, but shifts its geographic and structural focus. Environmental explanations remain central to understanding this transition, but they are no longer seen as sufficient on their own. Evidence of prolonged drought cycles during parts of the terminal classic period is strong, drawn from lake sediments, cave formations, and other paleoclimate records. Yet drought alone cannot explain the full pattern of abandonment, especially given the variation between regions. Instead, climate stress appears to act as a multiplier, intensifying existing vulnerabilities within political and economic systems already under strain. Warfare and political fragmentation also play a critical role. The classic Maya world is not a unified empire but a dense network of competing city-states. This system is highly dynamic but also inherently unstable. Alliances shift frequently, rivalries persist across generations, and competition for resources remains constant. Over time, this sustained competition increases pressure on agricultural systems, trade networks, and political legitimacy. When combined with environmental stress, the result is a gradual erosion of system-wide resilience. One of the lesser-known but significant insights from recent research is the role of feedback loops within this system. Environmental stress can intensify warfare, which in turn disrupts agriculture and trade, which then further weakens political stability. These interacting pressures do not operate in isolation. They reinforce one another, creating cascading effects that vary across regions and time periods. The result is not a single collapse, but a series of interconnected regional transformations. Population movement is another key factor. As certain urban centres decline, populations do not simply disappear. They relocate, often toward more stable regions such as parts of the northern Yucatan or areas with better access to water and agricultural resources. This migration reshapes the demographic and political landscape of the Maya world, contributing to the rise of new centres and the decline of older ones. Civilization persists, but in redistributed form. Archaeological evidence also suggests that cultural continuity remains remarkably strong despite these changes. Writing systems, calendrical knowledge, and ritual traditions continue in various forms across different regions. Even where monumental inscriptions decline, other forms of cultural expression persist. This continuity challenges older interpretations that framed the transition as a total cultural break. Instead, it points to adaptation and transformation within a long-lived civilizational tradition. Another lesser-known dimension of this process is the importance of local resilience. Some communities appear to adapt more successfully to changing conditions by diversifying agricultural strategies, reorganizing settlement patterns, or shifting political structures. These adaptations are not uniform, but they demonstrate that the response to crisis is highly localized. The Maya world does not respond as a single entity, but as a collection of interconnected yet independent societies. Over time, the most visible centers of power shift northward, and new political configurations emerge. These later systems are not simply continuations of the classic period, nor are they entirely separate civilizations. They represent a reorganization of earlier traditions under new environmental, political, and social conditions. The identity of the Maya persists, but its expression changes across time and space. When Spanish observers later encounter these societies, they are seeing not the classical world at its peak, but its transformed descendants. By then, centuries of internal change have already reshaped political structures, settlement patterns, and cultural expressions. Colonial disruption adds another layer of fragmentation, further obscuring the continuity between ancient cities and living communities. Modern archaeology, therefore, is not uncovering a single lost civilization, but reconstructing a long continuum of change. Each excavation, inscription, and environmental record adds detail to a much larger and more complex picture. The Maya world emerges not as a static achievement frozen in time, but as a dynamic system that evolves, adapts, and reorganizes itself across centuries. One of the most striking realizations is that the question itself, why did the Maya disappear, is increasingly seen as misleading. The Maya did not vanish. Their cities changed, their political systems transformed, and their centres of power shifted, but their cultural and historical presence continues in descendants, languages, traditions, and landscapes that still carry traces of the ancient world. What changes is visibility, not existence. The ruins buried beneath the jungle are not simply remnants of failure. They are records of a civilization that reached extraordinary levels of complexity in astronomy, writing, architecture, and environmental adaptation. They also reflect the limits of that complexity under shifting environmental and political conditions. In this sense, they are not just symbols of loss, but of human capability and adaptation over long periods of time. And as the final layers of understanding come into focus, the Maya world becomes less of a mystery that needs a single answer, and more of a long, unfolding story of rise, transformation, and continuity. A story in which collapse is not an ending, but one phase in a much larger cycle of change. When the jungle finally closes over the last visible stones of abandoned cities, it does not erase what came before. It preserves it in silence, in structure, and in hidden geometry beneath the canopy. And long after the last royal inscription is carved, the last temple is abandoned, and the last city fades from political memory, the world that once was continues to exist layered beneath the present, waiting to be rediscovered again and again through time. And in that quiet persistence lies perhaps the most enduring truth of all civilizations do not simply disappear. They transform, they scatter, they adapt, and they remain woven into landscapes, languages, and histories that continue long after their greatest cities fall silent.